Hi fellow orchid lovers! So as you can clearly see, I have all of these Phalaenopsis to repot. Two of them are Phalaenopsis that I bought at Walmart. Two of them are mini phals that I just recently bought at a nursery. And then the other two are rescue orchids that just need to be repotted. So we're gonna start off with the ones that I got from Walmart though. And they are these two gorgeous ones. They were both on clearance for $5. Obviously that's a really good price. I was so excited, but we're gonna go ahead and start off with these two because I did get requests to see how I repot them. So the first thing we have to decide is what size pot to put these into, because as you can see, they're still in their plastic sleeves. It's really unfortunate that they come in such tiny pots because they look very cute. They look very beautiful in a pot this size, and it's so convenient to have such a small pot, but they are going to need a bigger pot size. I bought this pot right here. This is a ceramic orchid pot. You can see it has little ventilation slits everywhere, but they're really pretty. So I bought that one for this pot for this orchid because I specifically bought this orchid for the flowers. So that's gonna go in here. You can see the size difference, definitely. And I'm just gonna try and keep it in here for as long as possible because this is a pretty small pot. And for this orchid, I have this pot size, which is the same pot as this. I wouldn't recommend putting it into such a bigger pot unless it has a lot of healthy roots. So we'll see how healthy the roots are. If not, I do have a smaller pot, like this size. But first of all, let's take a look at what's going on. So since I do know that I'm gonna be putting this orchid in this pot, I'm gonna start with this. This pot is so cute. I really wish I could keep it in here. I think it looks adorable, but I also do love this pot. It's my first time trying out a ceramic orchid pot. I bought this at Armstrong Nursery for $13, and it is a 5-inch pot. And I'm assuming this is a 3-inch pot. It's usually the size these come in. So I could be wrong, but that's what I'm guessing. So I'm gonna be squeezing around. I did soak this in water, but I think I'm gonna soak it in some more water because it's very compact in here. If you can tell, it's extremely compact. The next orchid I repot, we're gonna do a different angle so you can hopefully see better. So I added water to soak this, and I'm also soaking this one as well. While I wait for this to soak, I am using this sphagnum moss. This is a really good sphagnum moss. It also reflects how good it is in its price. So I sometimes use cheaper moss, but I've liked this one. And this is my first time using Orchiata bark. This bark is much more expensive than the bark that I usually use. I bought the biggest size because I didn't want to have small bark chunks. I don't really have orchids with super fine roots, so I think the bigger the bark chunks, the better. This is the Premium Power Plus. Like I said, I've never tried it before, but I hear this being recommended a lot. And I finally decided, like, let's shill out some money for this. Okay, I got my shears, and now let's see if the water has all absorbed. Looking pretty good. Let's free this little baby. First of all, let's get rid of this label. See how easily it comes out because this is very, very stuffed in here, and I might have to cut it out. Okay, I'm gonna cut it out just so I don't damage anything. I really want this orchid to survive and do well, so I'm just cutting off the plastic little container that it's in. There we go. Here's the root ball. It's very compact in here, so I'm gonna just remove the sphagnum moss that's in here. So pretty much all that I'm doing is removing the sphagnum moss little by little. I tried as hard as I could not to disturb the roots because I want them to be as intact as possible, but I'm also not exactly being gentle because it's a pretty hardy plant
and you can probably see, but there's a lot of green, healthy roots. And since I soaked it, it helped the roots to become more flexible. So I wasn't as worried about the roots breaking off as I would be if I didn't soak the orchid at all. It would also be much harder to remove the sphagnum moss.
And now we're moving on to the second orchid. Also gonna cut this one out.
Whenever orchids come in a sleeve like this, a sleeve of plastic, it's really easy to just cut them out, and that's usually the easiest way to do it. But sometimes they do come in slotted plastic pots, and normally I don't want to cut the plant out because I want to reuse the pot. So if the orchid comes in a pot that can be reused, I will try as hard as I can to get the orchid out without breaking the pot. It might be a little more difficult, but sometimes I'm even willing to sacrifice some of the healthy roots since orchid pots do tend to get kind of expensive.
Okay, let's cut some of these roots off.
Now you can generally tell if a root is healthy based off of the coloring. Pretty much almost all of these roots are green and they're thick and they're turgid, so it's easy to just glance at them and see that they're healthy. Sometimes when the roots are cracked like this, I just rather cut them off even though the actual root is intact. The velamen is broken, so I rather just get rid of it, let the orchid grow out some new roots instead, unless there are white tips at the end, which signifies that the root is still growing. And these inner roots are a little bit more yellow than green, but that's fine. It doesn't really matter the color, as long as it's not brown and mushy or it's just like a stick without any velamen. The velamen is the green part surrounding the root, protecting the root, absorbing the water. So pretty much just cut off anything brown, squishy, that doesn't look healthy. Also, if there's a root that ends in a dead portion, but the rest of it is healthy, don't cut at the point where the root is still healthy, cut below that point. So leave a little dead tip on there so that the root doesn't have to heal that new wound.
Okay, so this one's good for now as well. And next I'm going to be doing these orchids, which came from Green Thumb. As you can see, $14.99, which is a long way from how much these were for $5 on clearance. So I've been putting off repotting these ones specifically, and you can see that it's sprouted new roots since it's been here, and they haven't made their way down to the medium yet, so we can give it some good new medium for it to grow into instead of this old one.
Again, it's the same process as the other two orchids of removing as much sphagnum moss as possible. Hopefully all of it, as much as you can, without feeling like you're harming the orchid too much. I did soak it a little more to help it kind of come apart easier, but go ahead, feel free to take your time on this because it's kind of therapeutic to just rip apart this old sphagnum moss. I don't know why. It's just kind of fun to do. I do also want to point out that none of the orchids that I worked on today had those plugs that you can see in some plants that you get. Sometimes it's in houseplants, sometimes it's an orchid, but it's kind of a really dense center part of, I think it's peat moss or coco, some kind of soily substance, and it is really hard to get that off, but it's essentially just a way more intense version of what I'm doing here. You gotta get in there and get rid of it. Those plugs can end up suffocating whatever roots are in there, and I find that my plants struggle whenever I keep those plugs, so try to get rid of it as best as possible.
Isn't it crazy how a mini phal has such a huge root system?
You can see that there are a ton of healthy roots on this orchid. This orchid is just generally doing very well, but if it wasn't, there were a lot of dead roots, then I would have cut off the flower spike. But since it's doing so well, there's no need. It can spend some energy on making flowers.
This actually seems like a pretty healthy root system. I don't think there's much to cut. And last but not least, we got this fella, which I got on clearance for $3. It's the same as the one I just took out, but instead of paying the full 15, I only paid the $3 since it was on clearance. And it's since put out a new flower spike, and it's also bloomed, which look at those blooms. This is such a pretty orchid.
I initially thought that this would be easy to just pull out, but it wasn't, so I just soaked it for a little bit and then it came out, slid out very easily. So goes to show you how much soaking these helps before actually repotting them.
So this one came out without needing to rip open the pot, thank goodness. So this one looks pretty good too. And that's really good for being a clearance orchid, huh? All right, so here's our orchid. All the moss and gunk is removed. I rinsed it. There's still some moss like very stuck to the roots, but I'm just gonna go ahead and leave them because I wanna get this potted up. Here is the pot it's going in. Sphagnum moss. Orchid bark, orchid, maybe a little too much in there. Here we go.
It's not very apparent while potting this orchid, but in the next one you'll hopefully be able to see it better. But I'm layering sphagnum moss and then bark and then sphagnum moss and then bark, just like that, because that's how an orchid YouTuber, Miss Orchid Girl, does it, and I just like it. I think it looks cool and it's kind of fun to do it that way, so I just do it the same way as she does. I highly recommend her channel for orchid content, but she also puts a top layer of bark at the top and I feel like it looks really pretty, so I do that as well.
All right, we've got the first orchid potted. You can kind of see a little bit of the layering through the sides, which I don't know how I feel about how that's looking, but I don't know. It's fine.
So it's definitely easier to see here the first layer of moss and then adding orchid bark around it, and then another layer of moss, orchid bark, moss, orchid bark. If you want to, you can definitely mix the two, an even amount of both, depending on however you like it, but I find that it's kind of difficult to mix orchid bark and moss. It's kind of easier to layer them because they don't really mix very well. If you've tried it, you definitely know what I mean. So I think this layering works really well and it looks really nice too.
We got this baby potted up in a pretty big pot, so I'm gonna have to be careful on the watering, but it looks really good, really happy.
Last but not least, we have this guy, which is doing the worst out of all the orchids, which is funny because I've had this one before I had any of the others, so I done goofed on this one.
So this is why I wanted to repop this orchid, because I already expected this is how it would look. I repotted it a long time ago, but I did it really quickly and I knew that I broke a lot of the roots. So this rescue orchid needs to be re-rescued.
I decided to cut off a lot of the roots that were looking kind of suspicious because I didn't want to go through the same situation where I knew I broke the root, but I just left it there and then the root just died inside the pot. I wanted to avoid that happening again, so I took off a lot of the root mass, and I'm just gonna let the new roots grow in because there are new roots poking out and they're ready to support this orchid, and we're just gonna get rid of the old ones, out with the old and with the new. And look how much easier it is to pot this when there's not so many roots holding it back.